So we talk about layout and grids. With our first assignment, we're going to be looking into that. Basically, every single publication, including our book, works on grid principles. So, going into our assignment, we're going to be exploring grids, and I'll go into the specifics in a little bit. What we have here just to show us. So when we look into the required reading is going to be planning your design. Optional reading, I recommend that you take a look at it at least. Is going to be page layout basics. It gives you some good ideas for some basic strategies for page layout. So as we go through, I'll just preview it. Planning your design, again, in our assignments folder, these materials are here. Also, the materials, just the PDFs, if it's like readings or something, I'll also put the readings on our class site as well. So we have the two different locations for these. But the planning your design goes through not just, it's a little bit dated, but the information doesn't date at all because it's all still super relevant. But it goes through a variety of different publications, different types of publications. CD booklets, for example, the different kinds of fold, where you have a gate fold, where it essentially opens up like a gate from the middle. A single fold, a booklet, gate fold with a booklet can actually be done, which is kind of interesting. Or an accordion fold. Brochures, again, all the different types of folds. Custom formats, et cetera, et cetera. But all of these rely on even... why am I blanking? Like physical objects, like burger boxes. I'm assuming it's like a hot dog box or something. I don't even. Anyway, they rely on some sort of grid structure, grid system, right? So as we have here, developing and working with a grid, you can have a simple 2-column grid, 3-column, 4-column, et cetera, et cetera. It's basically, essentially, a guide for you to follow for publications. And again, you can see even with this 2-grid format here, you can break up that grid, having this, this diagonal break, and then whatever element, whether it's a pull quote or an image in the middle here, you can break up your grids with images, working with margins and gutters. So margins are... Like I had explained before, exactly what they are, the page margins, the blank space between the edge of the page and the start of your content. And then the gutters are in between your columns. So you have whether you're working with a grid or if you're working with, you can actually break up text frames into columns as well. So you can have gutters in between those columns, and they often do, but they can match your margins and overall your document gutters. They don't have to. You can have them be double or you can have them be half as well. So again, all of these are, general guidelines, a place to start, and then you can sort of break the rules from there. So you see here, we talk about bleeds, single pages, bleeds, subdivisions, facing pages, and spreads. And here, these are basically like the thumbnails I was talking about. Like when you thumbnail an idea, you have, this would be reflecting essentially like an image and then text, or breaking up an image going across the spine with a 3-column format, having the 1 column go from top to bottom, and then having these go about half, et cetera, et cetera. So these are generally going to go over how working with grids and how they essentially start to work. And I'll go over super basics of it. And then we'd start talking about gathering imagery, gathering ideas. Basically, you want to thumbnail some ideas, come up with some layouts, things like that, and then content gather, and then plug your content in, right? So we talk about that. Getting into, it talks about sketching, thumbnailing. I know it's not my favorite. I'm sure it's not everybody's favorite. But it is, again, super, super handy. We talk about, and again, even if you have margins and gutters, if you're thumbnailing physically, like actually drawing, It doesn't have to be exact. If you want to, obviously you can, but you don't have to have, you don't have to lay out your paper with like perfect 1/4 inch gutters and whatever. As long as you have a general idea of how your gutters and margins are going to work, like this, obviously that's not exact. Theoretically this margin is smaller than this margin, but it's just a rough idea. It's like sketching almost anything out. And then it gets into creating various different designs for different applications. To really get, what thumbnailing does is allows you to hopefully come up with as many possibilities for a design as you can. And this is more specifically talking about a logo here, but giving you the ideas for exhausting your options. And then it gets into some, I know I said this before, but it gets into some more advanced things like die cutting. Die cutting is basically cutting along a specific shape, things like that. Like there's lots of companies now that are doing some really interesting things with business cards. We can do some custom die cut business cards fairly inexpensively, which is pretty sweet. I have a friend who's a barber, and he has this really cool blade business card, which is pretty awesome. And it's got a custom die cut in it. It's pretty awesome. It's pretty neat to see, like, I don't know. I feel like it's like that, what is that, the scene in American Psycho? Have you guys seen that? Where they're showing off their business cards, and they're like, it also takes place, I think, in like the early 80s, so its business cards are very minimal. But anyway, he has this internal dialogue about, like, this guy has a better font than he does, and his paper is way better than him. Anyway, business cards say a lot still. It's crazy. The business cards do still say a lot. Like, if somebody, he happens to be a good barber, but if you're taking the time to create something as custom and cool as that, like, if you're taking the time for your business card, like, generally, like, that's probably speaks a lot to how you handle your business as well, So, it's kind of the same concept as, like, a lot of times people buy wine or beer because of the label, right? It's, if you take the time to put the effort into your label, chances are you've put that effort into what goes into the bottle, right? Theoretically. It's not always the case. But, and then page layout basics. I'll just go over this relatively quickly. This, again, talks a little bit more about aligning elements either with a grid or working juxtaposed to a grid. Again, dividing to the rule of thirds, that old golden ratio. For those of you that have taken, I'm assuming they go over it in 2D or photography. I'm sure Jody's talked about the rule of thirds in photography, knowing Jody. And again, some various design element stuff that we will go over as we get more and more detail. But it's a good preview. Again, when I talked about white space or negative space, using it effectively, using negative space effectively can really, I'm trying to not say effective twice, can really create a solid design. Like, again, going back to the label thing, if you think about one of my, I don't know if I'd say favorite, but going back to the beer thing, like Maine Beer Company, their whole brand is clean products, clean design, clean whatever. So they have very, very, very minimal labels. Like their labels, they bottle everything. They don't can anything, but their labels are all like pretty much like 90% white space, and it has their logo really small, the name of the beer super small, and then whatever legal information where it has to go. But their labels are pretty much like really stark and really clean, and it's a look. Like when you, I think I talked about it last class when we talk about like I forget what the actual term is, but like how something appears on a shelf. Every product is competing for shelf space, right? Like when you go to the supermarket, you go wherever, like all those, that eye level ish, those like 2 rows that are give or take about eye level, like those are sought after. Like that's in the industry, like that's no joke. Like that product placement is like people get really cutthroat about where stuff appears and that. But you also have to have, so if you don't have that shelf space, also obviously boutique stores, like your craft beer stores obviously are very different, like how they handle things. But in general, the larger stores, you have to pop off that shelf more. Like you have things like it talked about with like, again, you go to any store and you see whatever brand's part of the brand, like Pepsi, you see even their colors and that goofy circle thing, that's Pepsi. Or you even just going down the stupid Tide Pods were in the news recently, I guess, whatever, non-story. But you even just looking down the detergent aisle, like you pretty much know the brands just by not even reading it, but just by the colors. So things like that go heavily, and a lot of times that negative space and using color comes into play with all that. That was a long way to go to talk about negative space. But you get the general idea. So when we talk about grids and layout specifically, I have all these materials. Again, we have our grid samples in our assignment here. So when we're talking about grids, this is a good example of digital thumbnailing. So you have, a table of contents, and then you have some various different title and content thumbnails to just show, this would be like here they have a combo between a 3-grid and a 2-grid structure. Here's a 3-grid with an image on the other page. Here's our 3-column rather. Here's another 3-column, a 2-column thumbnail, another 3-column thumbnail. So you get the kind of idea of some basic points to start. And then once you get into a basic grid structure, and each publication, again, and it's going to be up to the publisher. If you come up with your own publication, for whatever reason, you could have a 13-column grid structure if you want to. It's really kind of arbitrary. It's up to the publisher. A general rule, though, for more traditional publications are going to be 3 to 4 columns, generally. Usually 9 times out of 10, 3 columns, I would say. But then you have some other publications. You get into like some of the more really specific publications, like something like Time versus like Juxtaposed magazine, which is a really weird art magazine. Very interesting, but weird art magazine. When you get into something like that, like Juxtaposed is going to have they're going to break the grid structure and do weird, crazy layouts. Whereas like Time is pretty much going to be pretty traditional, 3 columns, images are not going to be too crazy, things like that. So it's going to depend on the publication as well and what the attitude of that publication is. So you have here, you have this grid structure, a 7-column, give or take, because even the margins are a little bit weird. But you can see how they use this grid structure to do a very alternative layout, to where you would have essentially a title going this way, and then maybe some image content, and then you would have what I'm guessing would be here, would be your text content, or vice versa. You might have the text content going this way, and have here the text content, here and an image. So whether the purple is the image, or the greenish is the image, or whichever one is the text, the copy, to use a publishing term. Whatever the copy is, let's say the purple is copy and the green is image, or vice versa. It gives you an idea of, they still have a basic grid structure, but they're really breaking the bounds of that grid. I mean, they have this weird shape that goes across the spine of the magazine and into the other section. And again, with a lot of the diagonals and things like that. So it's giving you a structure, but it's also allowing you to design within that structure. And also, the grid helps you to create a really balanced design, right? So even though when we talk about negative space, there's a lot of negative space here, but you have this kind of odd elongated shape that goes into the next page. So that balances that negative space really well as well. This is a little bit more traditional. It's where we have essentially a 4-column structure. Again, depending on the type of magazine that this is, they have a little bit of, their margins are a little bit odd on this side, but that's just how the publication is. But you can see it's where they break the bounds of the grid a little bit even here. They open up the grid to set up their title page, have the image go across all of the grid columns. This one, breaks the bounds of 2 grids, but essentially you have a fairly clean, fairly standard look here. And then lastly, I feel like these examples are the better examples because it's a good mix. It's going to pixelate a little bit, but it's a good mix of traditional, non-traditional. And you can see here they overlay clearly where the grids are. So this is a 3-column grid structure where they have a pull quote, which is usually it's a quote that's pulled from the content and it's a breakout. I'm sure we've all seen that in publications where sometimes they have a box around them, sometimes they don't, where the text flows around that pull quote. But you can see even how, this image breaks the bound of the grid just a little bit, but you have, the 1 column image here, and you have the 3 column image at the top, but primarily it keeps with that pretty solid 3 column grid structure. And again, going to this one, where this one's a little bit less traditional, where we technically have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, again, it's a little odd, column structure, but they have the text go across two columns at least, so it still handles in a similar manner to like either a 2 or 3 column layout, but it gives them that general idea, and it gives them a good plan to follow when they have these sort of more non-traditional shapes going across all these different odd columns, and it allows them to set up the text very differently. And again, with this, you have a really good balance between image. When you're working with page layout, it's not, obviously it's somewhat similar to illustration or other types of design, but you're dealing with, when you deal with copy as a design element, even though it's almost, it's straight up copy, but you still have to consider it as part of the design. So once you add text as another element rather than just shapes and images, you still have to kind of consider your copy as a design element. So that's where this grid structure obviously helps. So you can still create this really balanced design where you have a nice balance again here between. The only thing that really kind of bugs me is that little corner. Every single time I look at it, I just kind of like, you could tweak that up just a touch or tweak that down, or anyway, just to fill that little space. But you can see again they have a really nice balance between image and copy and negative space to create a really balanced layout here. And that's what we're going to be looking at in our first assignment